It begins with a whisper from the past, the kind of rumor that echoes in empty halls and sticks to the bones of a town that no one visits anymore. Imagine walking through a forgotten archive, brushing dust from brittle papers, and stumbling upon a case so grotesque that even the ink seems to bleed with shame. This isn't just a story. It's a scar carved into human history. A man who, by all accounts, should have been erased from memory, chose to carve away his own humanity, quite literally. He removed his own face, and instead of hiding, he wore it proudly, as though the mutilation was his crown. Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep, because once you hear what I am about to tell you, there's no turning back. The tale takes us back to a century where whispers carried further than truth, and a man's madness was often masked by silence. Records are scattered, but piecing them together paints a disturbing portrait. He was not born into cruelty. No, he was born into the quiet folds of an ordinary village, where families tended fields and sang songs at dusk. Yet, beneath his seemingly plain exterior, something unraveled. Town gossip suggested he would sit alone for hours, sketching distorted faces, as though studying the collapse of the human form. He had an obsession, not with death, but with disfigurement, an urge to dismantle what nature had shaped. Neighbors recalled his eyes, not vacant, but sharp, cutting into others as though peeling away the skin in his mind. When livestock went missing, no one dared accuse him. When tools vanished from barns, people swallowed suspicion, because they feared him. Fear, in those days, was rarely spoken, but always understood. One evening, his mother found him before a cracked mirror, his skin marked with thin scratches, shallow rehearsals of something dark. And soon after, the rumors grew into truths too twisted to ignore. He did not wait for violence to find him. He brought it upon himself. And when he finally tore away his own face, he did not scream. He smiled. That is where our story begins, not with the act of cruelty upon others, but a man turning his own flesh into a mask, parading through the village as though daring the world to look away. The night he first revealed himself to the village remains a fractured legend, preserved only in whispers. It was said that the man walked calmly into the town square, under the weak glow of oil lamps, his face a horrifying patchwork of torn flesh and stitched attempts at preservation. Some claimed he had boiled his own skin before reattaching it, like leather, stretched too thin. Others swore it was still wet, glistening under the moonlight. Whichever version you believe, one detail endures across every retelling. He was smiling, as if liberated. The villagers froze. No one screamed. No one dared to move. To scream would have meant acknowledging the truth, that madness had stepped into their midst and taken human form. Children were pushed behind shutters, doors were bolted, but no one dared confront him. He stood in the silence, his breathing heavy, his blood seeping onto cobblestones, and then he bowed, as if his mutilation was a performance, a theater of horror staged for an unwilling audience. What makes this tale more disturbing is how the village reacted afterward. Instead of confronting him, they buried the story beneath silence. Priests refused to mention his name in sermons, officials quietly removed records, and neighbors never spoke of what they saw. Some believe the town itself conspired to erase him, to cut him out of history. But history has a strange way of resisting erasure. Fragments of documents survive in forgotten archives. Doctors' notes describing tissue that seemed preserved beyond expectation. A diary written by a midwife who swore she saw him days later, walking the fields with his grotesque mask still intact. She wrote, "It was as though his face was no longer human, but a relic, and he wore it proudly, as if daring God himself to strike him down. And yet he lived, not only lived, but thrived in his own way. People left food at his doorstep, not from kindness, but from terror. He had transformed into a figure of folklore while still alive, half man, half legend, and entirely feared. What kept him alive was not community, nor medicine, but fear itself. Fear preserved him better than any surgeon's hand ever could, and that, perhaps, was his true intent all along. The deeper you dig, the more the fragments of this man's life begin to resemble a ritual rather than a simple act of madness. Some scholars have suggested that what he did to himself was not impulsive, but deliberate, a ceremonial stripping away of the self. In cultures long forgotten, there were whispers of skin as a vessel of the soul, of wearing one's own flesh as a shield against spirits. Could he have unearthed these ideas, twisting them into his own private theology? His journals, if they can be trusted, offer unsettling clues. A handful of pages were discovered decades later, buried in a trunk hidden beneath the floorboards of his family's farmhouse. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, but the words carried a dreadful certainty. "The skin is not prison," he wrote. "It is proof. Without it, I am nothing. With it, I am eternal." The very idea that his flesh was not just his identity, but his sanctuary, reveals a mind that was slipping between worlds, half tethered to reality, half drifting into something much darker. There are records of villagers who claimed to hear him speaking to himself in the fields at night, reciting phrases in a language no one recognized. Some even swore they saw him kneeling, lifting his stitched and flayed face toward the sky, as if presenting it to something unseen. What he worshipped, or what he feared, remains unknown. But the silence of the town suggests they believed his ritual was not madness, but a curse that could spread if spoken aloud. Over time, his face became more than flesh. It became an artifact of terror. A farmer once wrote that when he saw the man crossing the valley at dusk, the stitched mask seemed to glow pale, like wax under moonlight. Whether it was a trick of the eye or the fever of imagination, it cemented the man's reputation as something more than human. And yet, beneath the horror lies a strange truth. He was never arrested, never punished. To capture him would mean touching him, acknowledging him. Instead, the villagers chose to let him haunt the edges of their lives, hoping that silence could bury what sight could not erase. As the years dragged on, the man with the stolen face became less of a neighbor and more of a haunting. Children grew up with warnings whispered at bedtime. Never wander into the fields alone. Never look too long at a stranger's reflection, and never mention the man who carried his own skin. Silence was their shield, but silence has a way of breeding myths. Travelers passing through the village left behind curious accounts. One described seeing him outside an abandoned church, his body stiff, his face hanging unnaturally still, as though it were a mask carved from stone. Another traveler wrote of waking at dawn to find him standing motionless at the edge of the forest, watching from the tree line. He never spoke, never attacked, but his presence itself seemed to hollow out the air. And so, the legend spread beyond the town, carried by rumors into nearby villages, then woven into cautionary tales told around firelight. There are those who believe the villagers allowed him to continue because he became a necessary evil. In times of famine, they whispered his name as though invoking him might spare their children. When sickness swept through households, some secretly left offerings outside his dwelling, bowls of water, cuts of meat, even small trinkets. It was as though his self-mutilation had transformed him into something closer to a deity of fear, one who demanded not worship but acknowledgement. But history, unlike folklore, leaves behind shadows that can be measured. Medical notes recovered from a nearby asylum mention a man without features, wearing his face as if stitched upon wax. The description is clinical, but the tone suggests disbelief even from the physician. There was no record of his confinement, no official declaration of his death. Only the acknowledgement that such a figure had been seen, examined, and somehow released. And so he endured, walking, the line between myth and man, a reminder that horror does not always arrive with claws or fire, but with silence, secrecy, and flesh reshaped into something unrecognizable. The town pretended he was gone, but the absence of closure only sharpened the unease. What became of him? Did he vanish into the forest, swallowed by his own ritual? Or does his mask still hang somewhere, waiting for another to wear it? Time did not erase him. It only deepened his mystery. Decades later, fragments of testimony emerged, tucked inside court transcripts and forgotten letters. A soldier returning from war claimed to have seen him wandering the countryside, unchanged by the years, his stitched face still intact. He looked at me, the soldier wrote, and I felt older, as if he had carried centuries in his skin. Others dismissed the account as trauma-fueled imagination, but whispers grew louder. The man had not died. He had endured. And yet, endurance was not his gift. It was his curse. For what is a man who cannot be forgotten but cannot be named? He became a walking contradiction, erased in records, alive in rumor. In one archived newspaper clipping, an unnamed wanderer was described as terrifying livestock, appearing suddenly in barns at night, then vanishing before morning. No crime was pinned to him. No hand dared accuse. But the implication was there. His presence was enough to unhinge the natural order. Folklore has a way of binding itself to fear, and in time, he was no longer spoken of as a man. He was the faceless one, a being who haunted the edges of villages, who appeared in mirrors when one lingered too long in the dark, who stole not lives, but peace. Mothers told their children not to whistle after dusk, for the sound would draw his attention. Lovers whispered his name only in jest, daring fate to answer. And some, in secret, claimed they saw him in their dreams, always watching, always smiling through ruined flesh. But what unsettles historians most is the lack of finality. There is no grave, no documented death, no body, only fading references that vanish as suddenly as they appear, as if he had dissolved into the folklore he inspired. Did he carve his own disappearance as carefully as he carved his own face? Or did the town, complicit in silence, finally bury him where no one could ever find him? And yet, there are still those who claim that if you wander deep enough into forgotten villages of Europe, where ruins sink into moss and bells no longer ring, you may see him. Standing still, waiting, his mask of flesh clinging unnaturally to his skull. A figure not alive, not dead, but preserved in terror itself. If silence was the weapon the village wielded, time was the accomplice that carried him into obscurity. But obscurity does not mean absence. It means shadows. And shadows, as every historian knows, have weight. Generations later, researchers stumbling across faint references to the man described the sensation of finding something that should not exist. His name, whatever it once was, had been erased from birth records, church registers, and burial ledgers. All that remained were fragments, letters written in fear, medical notes written in disbelief, and a single entry in a parish log that simply read, "The one who wears himself." Such deliberate absence only raises more questions. Who protected him? Who allowed him to live unpunished? Some argue that the village hid him because they feared the consequences of his exposure, what outsiders might do if they knew. Others whisper of something far more unsettling, that the villagers began to see him not as a threat, but as a talisman. To live beside horror was to believe it shielded them from greater horrors. There are disturbing hints of this. Old folklore collected from the region speaks of a man who wears his own mask, being invited to the edges of weddings, births, and funerals. He never spoke, never joined, but his presence was treated as both omen and blessing. Some villagers believed that to be seen by him meant protection from sickness, as though his mutilation absorbed misfortune. The thought is grotesque, yet the testimonies repeat with unnerving consistency. Historians struggle with such contradictions. Was he a pariah, shunned and erased? Or was he a relic, tolerated because his horror served a purpose? It is here the story drifts away from fact and into the fog of collective memory. But fog often hides truths that written history dares not admit. Perhaps the most haunting detail of all is a note scrawled in key margin of an anonymous journal found in the ruins of a nearby farmhouse. It reads, "He was still walking when I was a child. He carried no lantern, yet the night bent around him as if lit by his face. No date, no name, just the quiet confirmation that he remained." History is filled with men who committed crimes so terrible their names became immortal. Yet this man defies that rule. He is remembered not by his name, but by his absence. To wear his own face was not simply an act of madness, but a declaration that he would not be erased by flesh nor by time. And in a way, he succeeded. Though his records were destroyed, though the village buried his memory beneath silence, his legend remains. There are reports, even in the 20th century, of a faceless wanderer seen drifting through rural towns in Eastern Europe. A schoolteacher in the 1920s swore she saw him at the edge of a classroom window one winter morning. A farmer in the 1940s described a man whose face was stretched thin, like leather drying in the sun, standing in his field at night. In each case, the witnesses fled, and in each case, the figure vanished without trace. But the descriptions, always the same. It is tempting to dismiss these accounts as hysteria, the echo of folklore living on in frightened minds. Yet, in the corners of dusty archives and forgotten attics, there remain images too strange to ignore. Grainy photographs, blurred silhouettes, faint outlines of something, or someone, lurking in the background. Historians argue over authenticity, but one thing is undeniable. The legend of the man who wore his own face has never truly died. And that is perhaps the most disturbing truth of all. Because stories like his are not meant to end. They are meant to linger, to haunt, to press themselves into the walls of our memory, like stains we cannot scrub away. To ask whether he still walks is less important than admitting that he never left. He exists in every whisper of horror, in every shadow that lingers too long, in every uneasy reflection that makes us turn away from the mirror. For in the end, he was never just one man. He was what happens when horror mess survival, when silence becomes faith, and when flesh itself becomes a legacy. The faceless wanderer remains, not in graves, not in books, but in the quiet dread that some truths cannot be buried.